This is Transcending Physical Trauma. I'm James Hamlin. I'm a writer for The Atlantic magazine. We have three excellent panelists who I will introduce in turn, and each is going to give a 10-minute talk from the podium. So we're going to start with Krista Donaldson. She is the CEO of DREV, which stands for Design Revolution, which is a nonprofit that designs and delivers medical products to people living on less than $4 a day. So, great. Krista?
So good morning. I'm going to talk about, in terms of trauma, limb loss. I'm going to go to the first slide. Is that possible?
Oh.
Thanks. It's 8 a.m. Perfect. So losing a limb.
It's the first black slide.
Yep, it's black. Good. Losing a limb, regardless of how it happens, is life-changing. And in the developing world, a majority of amputations are a result of trauma. So Jim mentioned DREV, the organization I lead. Our mission is to close health inequities. And one of our products is a prosthetic knee, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Interestingly, the dominant cause of amputation, particularly to trauma, is different by region. So in places, and I think Mick's going to talk a little bit about this, hopefully, in war regions, it can be as a direct result of conflict. It can also be post-conflict result of landmine. In India, where we do most of our work, it's traffic-related. And so one of the amputees we've worked with, he was a young boy, he was jumping off the school bus, his pant leg got caught as the bus was pulling away. We also see people riding on motorcycles. I mean, you can see this is a scene from Delhi, riding a motorcycle and getting hit by a truck. This is a picture of Dr. Pooja Mokal. She's at the Jaipur Foot Clinic in India, and she's really an expert, and she fits people, upper limb, lower limb, but she's the person that once the amputee has had the surgery, oversees their fitting and their remobilization if it's an upper limb injury. You can see her talking to some of the technicians at the Jaipur Foot Clinic, and she's actually holding our knee. So what she talks about with her patients is that 78% of the amputations at the Jaipur Foot Clinic are a direct result of trauma. So the non-traumatic fitting of prosthetics is related to diabetes, malignancy, and just medical care that went wrong and resulted in an amputation. The victims she sees of trauma, there we go. This is Kamal. Kamal's 16, but this is the profile of patients she sees. They're young, they're very often male. They have a full life ahead of them. They're very active, and their expectations of a prosthetic limb are very different than other patients. So a patient with diabetes, for example, tends to be older, has other medical conditions going on, and less confidence in their activity and their activity level. But with these younger patients, Dr. Mokal says that they don't even ask about walking again. They assume they're going to walk. What they ask is, am I going to be able to ride my motorbike again? And she said that in one case that there were parents standing behind one of her patients, and the parents got really angry and said, how can you be asking that? You just got in an accident, and here you are asking about riding your motorbike again. So the challenge she sees with amputees who have suffered from trauma is adapting psychologically, but also ensuring that they have access to high-quality prosthetics because they push it much harder than some of the other patients she sees. So now I'm going to take you to another expert. This is Joel Sadler. He's a researcher at Stanford University, and he's actually a longtime DREV advisor. He's one of the designers behind what's now our remotion knee. As part of his research, though, he studied how amputees adapted to their prosthetic following an upper limb amputation, so an amputation either above or below your elbow. And he had an interesting set of findings. The type of prosthetic they chose depended on what happened to them. So amputees who had lost their arm due to trauma almost always chose an anthropomorphic limb. And anthropomorphic just means it looks, quote, normal. It looks like a regular hand. And you can see the young woman in this photo, because I'm standing here, I'll point it out. But you can see her hand, and I'm going to show you one that's more up close. There you go. This is the case particularly, the desire for anthropomorphic limbs is particularly the case in places like India because of the social stigma attached to having a disability. The problem with these hands, though, is that they tend to lack dexterity. But the interesting thing is amputees who are born without a limb they often choose this hook-style prosthetic, and this is actually called a HD work hook. And you can see Alan here. Alan's American. Oh, I went past Alan. Alan's American. He had a birth defect, and the result was that he was born without two of his hands, or two of his arms. And you can see his perspective is, I don't care how it works, I just really need it to work. But Joel also had an interesting finding about amputees who had suffered trauma. And they started out with the anthropomorphic hand, but then they very often later changed to the hook style. And if these were patients who were working or wanted to return to work, that time period was very short, on the order of weeks. And the example Joel gives, too, is with the anthropomorphic hand. It was very difficult, for example, if you had your wallet in your pocket, to be able to take it out. But with the hook style, you had that dexterity to do that. So we took these lessons from Joel and what we've learned from our patients and applied it to the design of our knee. And the thing we were really looking forward to was to balance the functionality. So the ability for our amputees to have a very active life, but also with their emotional needs and some of the other requirements they had. And of course, we got a lot of feedback from users, and I'll show you that in a minute. I wanted to show you what a leg system looks like, though. And imagine you have an amputation. It's anywhere between your knee or all the way up to your thigh. And so I'm going to move over here for one sec. But you have a socket that fits over your residual limb. You have the knee, which is the black part, the pylon, which think of it like your shin bone, and then the foot. And the knee there is one of these early prototypes, the Jaipur Knee. And the Jaipur Knee started in a Stanford University class, and we absorbed it at DREV, my organization. And in fact, the project manager is one of those original students. This is a close-up of the Jaipur Knee, and the first thing you should probably be thinking is it looks very bulky. It is. And we saw how users also modified it. Do you see that little black strip there where the arrow's pointing? That was added into the knee as it was tested, and this was tested over several years in India and several other countries. That black tape, as you can see, it's a noise dampener. So the knee would click a little bit when it was walking. And of course, if there's a stigma, you don't want to be bringing any more attention to the fact that you have a prosthesis. The other thing we saw is what we call profile smoothing. And so an ACE bandage was wrapped around this early knee to make it less bulky looking. And in fact, when we had tested it in China, there were some really interesting comments. People said, oh, it looked like a robot. But you can imagine when your knee is bent, the earlier version, it had these spikes, these little corners on it. So it was quite obvious, actually, you were wearing a prosthetic under your pants or your skirt or your sari. So this is how the Remotion knee came about. And a few things to point out. I actually have one here. I won't throw it to you, but I will pass it around. But a few things to notice when you open it up, there's a noise dampener in here. That's what this rubber is. And then on the outside, you can see it's streamlined to look more like a kneecap and be less obvious it's a prosthetic. So can I hand it to you, actually? Thanks. So you're looking at a picture of Nesa, one of the patients who tested our knee in Indonesia. He's very happy to be able to ride his motorcycle again. So one of the things we've learned from patients who've suffered from trauma, particularly in design, you have to address not just the functional requirements of your customers, but also their emotional requirements. And I want to end with a story of Prakash. You'll see his face in a minute. But he is really an incredible person in terms of transcending trauma. He was 18 years old when our team met him at the Jaipur Foot Clinic, and he lost his leg in a traffic accident. And when we had met him, he had actually just finished up his high school exams and had traveled to Jaipur from a few hours away without his family. And he told my colleagues that having a prosthetic doesn't prevent him from doing anything. He can still go to school, he can hang out with his friends, he can do all the things that teenagers do. What's harder, he said, is how people perceive him. They don't think he's capable, and he talked about looking for work and managers not giving him a chance because he's an amputee. And he tells of the story actually of how he got the job. He went to a grocery store and they were hiring stockers, so the people who move inventory around and stack things up. And the manager told Prakash, I'm not going to hire you because I don't think you can do all the lifting. And he said, give me an hour, I'll work for free, and then let's see how it goes. And he did. He worked for an hour. He worked alongside the other men, and he was hired at the end of that hour. So Dr. Mokul, who you met earlier, uses him as an example for many of her patients, just in terms of what what he has overcome and his ability to adapt suddenly to using a prosthetic. And we have this great quote from him that says, "You should never feel like a poor person because of your amputation. I am satisfied and happy, and I don't feel poor." And so I'm going to end with a little mini slideshow of him. The other thing is that today he's the primary breadwinner for his family. And thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Next we have Mark Roth. He's a cell biologist at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle, and his work is in reversible metabolic hibernation, which is exactly what you might imagine that it is from that combination of words.
It's great to be here. My work's a little different than the other speakers in the sense that rather than attempting to intervene after trauma, we're sort of, I guess since the title of this session is Transcending, we're trying to transcend trauma by intervening during the event. And so this is going on at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center with my colleagues there, and also in two different businesses that I founded, Icaria and more recently, Faraday Pharmaceuticals. What I want to do is tell you how we're using suspended animation technology to intervene during trauma, wherein we feel that we can diminish damage that's done and thereby do better for patients and have better outcomes. So in order to give you a sense of the work that we're doing, I'm going to have to give you maybe a little primer or an overview of what a trauma is and why it is that suspended animation, in fact, can improve outcome. So I'm going to choose for this to describe for you in some detail what a heart attack is, and then give you a sense of how we could intervene and improve outcome. So if you are, like we are here this morning, your blood's flowing freely in your arteries and veins and everything's fine, but if you were to have a blockage that would arrest blood flow in the left anterior descending coronary artery of your heart, then because you have a very small reserve of oxygen, then within about 6 seconds, you would fail to produce enough high-energy phosphates, and your muscles would no longer, muscle of the heart would no longer be able to contract. You wouldn't be able to bring blood to your tissues, and as a result, you would collapse to the ground, and somebody would get on their iPhone, and we would phone, and you would be rushed quickly to a trauma center. And during this time, your heart would be functioning poorly, and because of the poor perfusion, you would be suffering generally throughout your body. What they would do is there's this thing they do, they call it a door-to-balloon time. It's the length of time between when you get into the trauma center and when they have installed a catheter, usually in your groin, that runs up in through your heart and has actually got a balloon on the end, and then the balloon actually inflates, they disperse the blockage, and you reperfuse the tissue. Now, in the New York Times, on the front page last week, they described how if you, there have been great improvements in heart medicine, this cardiovascular disease and, in fact, the acute manifestation heart attacks, this is the leading cause of death for people in the United States. So they were advertising in the front of this article, on the front page last Sunday, that there's been a 38% decrease in the probability of dying during this process. And what they did at the beginning is they had a few paragraphs describing someone who actually had an event like this in New Jersey. And they were saying how because they got the balloon angioplasty to get blood flowing to the heart within about 90 minutes, that there was no heart damage. And in fact, that was not true. In fact, there is a great deal of damage that is suffered if you suffer temporary loss of blood flow. For instance, to the heart, there's this problem, which is that you have, upon reperfusion, much of your myocardium that was itself deprived of oxygen actually passes away. Forever you are then damaged in the left ventricle, for instance, and then your heart functions poorly and you have chronic heart failure, and that is unfortunately the way many people in the United States, the leading cause of death, as I said, in the US and generally thought of through the world according to the World Health Organization by 2020. So what are we doing and how are we intervening? Well, it turns out that in us, in the last few years, 15 or 20 years, it's been described that there are a variety of heinous toxins that are actually produced in us. Naming a few of them: carbon monoxide, nitric oxide, sulfide. And these agents, carbon monoxide, for instance, is the leading cause of suicide in the world. That's your inefficiently burning fuel. For instance, if you get in a garage and turn on the engine and allow the exhaust to accumulate, then you can commit suicide that way. Hydrogen sulfide was used as a chemical warfare agent in World War I. And in fact, the agent I'm going to tell you about today, spend most of the time on, is actually hydrogen selenide. That is 400 times more toxic than cyanide, which you might remember in movies like James Bond. They would bite on a little pill to die, avoiding giving away secrets. And so this is quite a bit more toxic than that selenide is. And in a paper that was just published actually this month in the Journal of Critical Care Medicine, we showed that this agent, which you are making right now in your body, and it is flowing in your veins right now, that this agent is actually targeted within minutes to recently reperfused tissue, wherein it has the effect to diminish metabolism, in effect to suspend or diminish metabolism of your recently reperfused tissue, and in so doing, if you will, holds back your horses so as to prevent damage that you would otherwise suffer that is irreparable damage, for instance, to your heart. And we learned about this by way of making radioactive selenide and watching it as it moves in your body, both before, during, and after reperfusion in a heart attack model in animals. We were able to show that this targeting occurs not just to, for instance, a heart during reperfusion, a heart attack, but also following a tourniquet injury after an animal suffers. I should say these are all animal studies so far, and that this accumulates in, for instance, a limb that has suffered ischemic injury or that is temporary loss of blood flow. And so what we learned is that there's this natural means of targeting agents that actually have the ability to repress or depress metabolism in your body, and that you have them naturally flowing in your body all the time. It turns out, though, depending on how much selenium you eat, you might have less or more than the next person around. And in fact, we find that animals with less and more of this agent do less and better in the heart attack model that we describe. In fact, if you have more selenide around, you can see as much as an 88% reduction in heart damage compared to the standard of care that you would see in a normal situation that you might have if you had a heart attack today. So this ability to depress metabolism by infusing, if you will, selenide by intravenous infusion at the time you're having the angioplasty to restore blood flow to your heart, we think has tremendous promise to decrease heart damage. And so what we're doing at Faraday Pharmaceuticals now is beginning human trials that will start in the later part of 2015. And I should say this idea of using agents that depress metabolism to affect a better outcome has also been true for another agent, nitric oxide, which a previous company that I founded called IWriter used. And in this situation, it's to treat babies who are born after difficult birth and are blue. So there's a problem that occurs with children when they're born. If they have a difficult time, then they're actually blue. And that's because, if you will, the pulmonary vasculature are contracted and the blood coming from the heart to the lungs is unable to reach the alveoli to get oxygen. And because of that, the babies are blue. So what we do, or what we in IWriter, is there's a tent that the baby goes into, and 20 parts per million of nitric oxide is put into the air. Now, that's not much air, that's nitric oxide. In fact, you have, for instance, 210,000 parts per million of oxygen, so we're only putting 20 parts per million of nitric oxide in there, so much less the amount of oxygen. And the babies breathe this in, and as they do, the nitric oxide actually, if you will, deanimates or reduces the metabolism of the vascular smooth muscle in the pulmonary vasculature, thereby allowing it to relax and expand, and the babies then can move the blood from their lungs to their heart back and forth, and they're no longer blue and they don't pass away. So we do this for thousands of babies every year, and so there is great promise, I think, for these very toxic agents that are present in our bodies, if you will, to intervene not so much after trauma, but rather to intervene during trauma, to really hold back your horses and to effect a better outcome as you live your life. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, we have Mick Ebeling. He's an entrepreneur. He's the founder of Not Impossible Labs, which has done some awesome stuff. They basically do technology for the sake of humanity. That's the catchphrase, and he's going to tell us about some of that awesome stuff.
I'm doing my own stopwatch just to make sure so you don't have to flash her. Have you guys seen Mark's talk? Has anyone here seen Mark's talk? You guys have, of course you guys have, but definitely check it out. There's some amazing, amazing stuff. So I'm going to just blast through some stuff. How many of you guys know about Not Impossible here? A couple people. Okay. So I'll blast through this really quick. The Not Impossible started because of this guy. This guy's name is Tempt. And in the 80s and 90s, Tempt was one of the foremost graffiti artists. And I met him because my wife and I went to a fundraiser, and we discovered at the fundraiser it was about this guy, and he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which many of you might know about now through the Ice Bucket Challenge. And so I have a production company. In my production company, we make films and television commercials and things like that. And instead of kind of the annual tradition of giving our clients inanimate objects or bottles of booze or something like that, we decided, let's make a donation on behalf of Temp's Foundation. So I went and sat down with his father and brother and said, hey, we're going to give you this money. What are you going to use it for? And his brother said, I just want to talk to him again. And that's when I learned that the way that most people in life with any kind of trapped-in syndrome speak through a piece of paper. And this is 2008, 2009 when I discovered this. And crazy enough, it's 2014, 2015, the other projects we've done on, people are still talking this way. And they basically, if you've seen the movie The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, they run their hand along a piece of paper, they get to the letter, and the patient blinks. And then they write that letter down. So it's archaic and it's ridiculous. So for me, that kind of was this realization of, that's absurd. That's preposterous, that's ridiculous, that's the way things exist. And so everything that we do at Not Impossible, we call as a revolution against the absurd. It's not a violent revolution, it's not Che Guevara, it's more of kind of a philosophical revolution of recognizing things that you see that are just ridiculous that they exist that way, and then saying, all right, we're gonna have to change that. So our process and the way that we approach everything that we do, and I didn't know this at the time of the Tempt introduction, is that you commit, and then you figure out how the hell you're going to pull it off. And at the time, I'm a producer. I produce things, which means I organize people together to actually do something. I had never said the words ocular recognition technology consecutively in a sentence. But I told his brother and his father, that's ridiculous that he's talking through a piece of paper. Let's change it. Let's actually get him to be able to talk, to actually be able to speak to you again, but also let's go a step further and let's actually make it so he can draw. So the way that I do that and the way that I've done that as a producer is that there's a thing in Hollywood, there's a thing in production that you do is that you always surround yourself with the best people. So my mantra is kind of around this is I surround myself with people that make me feel stupid. So the dumber I feel, the better off I am, which this panel is a good example of that. Because I know that at the end of this panel, I'm going to be a little smarter, and they're not going to be dumber per se, but I'm definitely going to win in the smart category of gaining more and kind of getting a little bit from them. So we went and we programmed and we hacked into some software, and we basically created a system that mapped the surface of the eye because we knew that Tempt could move his eye, and the way that he was kind of moving it and blinking, that was the binary switch that he was working, which if you think about your phone or you think about a mouse, that's the binary switch of our light switch is just moving and clicking. So the moving was his eye and the clicking was the blinking. So we went through that and we created this device, and the device is called the IWriter, and it was because all of the other devices that existed were $15,000 or something preposterous like that, we said, let's make something as low cost and as open, and let's make it open source. So it was made of cheap sunglasses from the Venice Beach Boardwalk where I live, a coat hanger. We hacked open a Sony PS3 camera. We mounted it to the front of, it says copper wire here, but we since have replaced that with something that is lighter, stronger, and more accessible called a coat hanger from the dry cleaners. And the device looked like this. something that Steve Jobs probably wouldn't be all that thrilled about, but that was highly, highly functional for what we needed to do. So we took it to Temp's room and gave it to him, and we kicked his bed around, and we broke into a car lot downstairs, and we set up a wireless projector, and we set up a wireless signal from his room down to the car lot, and he drew again for the first time in 7 years. It was this incredible experience, and it was an accident, because we just were like, sweet, this has worked, this is awesome. There wasn't any more thought besides that. And then we went to bed and we woke up the next day, quote, woke up the next day, and it was Time Magazine's Top 50 Inventions of 2010. Gizmodo called it 8 Incredible Health Inventions that Transform Lives. It's part of the permanent collection at the MoMA, and we were like, what the hell did we do? How did we do this? And how do we repeat it? And right around that same time, Temp sent us this email. And he said, that was the first time I'd drawn anything for 7 years. I feel like I'd been held underwater, and someone finally reached down and pulled my head up so I could take a breath. And that, for us, started this process of Non-Impossible and Non-Impossible Labs. And it's based on the premise of technology, but the world that I came from was technology, doing things like the James Bond main title sequence and graphic sequences and things like that. But now it's technology for this, as Jim said, it's technology for the sake of humanity. And what that means is, how do you take something and hack it and modify it and adapt it and make it so that it accomplishes a fundamental social and human need? That's what that means to us. So chapter 2 comes around. So chapter 2 comes around with this chance kind of introduction to a guy on July 11th who says, hey, you got to check out this doctor named Dr. Tom. So I go back and I check him out, and I've come to learn about Dr. Tom through this article by Alex Perry in Time Magazine, that he's the only doctor in South Sudan in this 1,500-mile radius who's serving all of these people. And at the end of the article, it talks about the thing he hates to do is to perform amputations. Well, that begs the question, why are people having to have amputations? And what I learned, since I'm educated in the United States and where most of us are geographically deficient and somewhat historically deficient, that there was a war going on, in a civil war going on in this area called the Nuba Mountains between South Sudan and Sudan. And the President Bashir, who you might have seen recently in the news, was committing this, just basically repeating this attempted genocide on the people of the Nuba Mountains. And the way he did it is he would bomb them. He would bomb these civilian populations in markets and bazaars and schools and churches. And he would, these very crude drums of fuel and shrapnel, he would roll out of the back of planes, and it would basically tear people's limbs off. And at the end of this article that I'm reading about it, Dr. Tom talks about this one particular boy, and it was Daniel. And Daniel was out tending his family's goats and cows, and he heard the Bashir's bombs coming, and he went, and he didn't have he didn't have a foxhole to jump into, so he hid behind a tree, and he wrapped his arms around a tree, and the bomb hit, and the tree protected his body, but the bombs blew off his arms, so he was a double amputee. And it's hard enough to exist in Sudan, period, but now being a double amputee made it even harder. So when he woke up, he said, if I could die, I would, because now I'm going to be such a burden to my family. And if you're a parent, or if you just can fathom a son or a daughter or a niece or nephew saying, I wish I was dead because now I'm going to be such a burden, that was kind of the moment for me, and that was the commit, then figure it out moment, because I couldn't imagine my 3 little knuckleheads saying that. So commit and figure it out, started the process, invited a bunch of people to my house that make me feel stupid. We started to hack, we started to play around with different types of prosthetics. How could we replicate the process of the IWriter and make something that's incredibly low cost but highly functional? Invited people who owned 3D printing. We started playing with balsa wood, played with all kinds of things. I hopped on a flight, I flew to Sudan, got to Sudan, set up shop in a little shed in the back. We started to kind of hack and print and make things and work with Daniel, who was it was a miracle in and of itself that we discovered, that we actually found Daniel. We started to play around with his arm and the ergonomics of how the arm would work. And our goal was to create a device that we could be made on location, but then after we left, it wasn't going to be a UN food drop, where we drop a crate of food and then fly out, and then when that food runs out, you're screwed, that's it, fend for yourself now. We wanted to make something that could be could continue on and that the locals can continue on. So on November 11th, 2013, which was exactly 4 months to the day that my friend told me about Dr. Tom, Daniel fed himself for the first time in 2 years. And he did it on an arm that we printed in South Sudan, in the refugee camp of Vida. And he did it, and that's pretty much what it looks like right there, which was this absolutely incredible experience. And the whole point of this for us was, how do we create something that could be replicatable, right? And so for us, the way we do it, with my background, we didn't decide to do this and set it up as a nonprofit. At first we did, but then we said, hey, how can we, I don't want to go out and constantly beg for our supper and rattle the tin cup. I want to make something that can continue on. So we took it back, and as a producer, we created this story called Project Daniel. We launched it on January 6th, and it blew up in the media. And then what this is for us is it's going to companies and telling companies, look, doing good is good business. And you've probably heard that before, but we approach it as doing good is good branding. So we take it from a marketing point of view. So our mantra is help one, help many. We help Daniel, we help Tempt, we're working with Dawn, we're working with a lot of people. And the ramifications of that is we focus on one person, and then we make that solution be able to help many, many people around that. And that's the lens we look through from a storytelling perspective. It's the lens we look through from a creation standpoint and a design process as well. So for us, we talk about that this is story versus Steve. We tell the story rather than create a Steve Jobs inspired type of device. So I would ask you guys today, and the question we ask to our brands and then we ask ourselves is, what is the story that we want to tell? And in that concept of help one, help many, who is your one? And in the concept of Daniel, who is your Daniel? Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Well, let's go right off of that and talk about scaling, because I know that for the Remotion prosthetic knee, that was a huge part of the process for you. And I don't think you got into the exact costs of how you factored in how you were creating the knee. That was, if you get a prosthetic knee as you're an insured person in the United States, it's costing something like $20,000.
Yeah, it depends on the type of knee. So, for example, a prosthetic knee. I'm going to keep talking. If they tell me something's wrong, I'll stop. So a prosthetic knee, for example, that a veteran would be fit with would cost anywhere for $20,000 and up. But it's really fancy. Like, you can program it to ride a bike, to run, to do all sorts of things. Our knee is a lower class of that. And you can still be very active in the U.S., though. It tends to be most of the amputees we have in the U.S. are now related to diabetes. But the class of knees that our knee fits into, they cost anywhere from $350 to $1,500. And processes tell us that they order them often on eBay because they're still too expensive for amputees in the U.S. Ours is $80 retail, and that's landed cost at the clinic. And interestingly enough, our target, as Jim had mentioned earlier, is countries where people live on less than $4 a day. But the most requests we've gotten into the office, we've gotten over 200 in the last year, have been from the U.S.
It's because of accessibility.
Yeah, accessibility is a big issue.
Yeah, you just can't. Right now it's impossible for, and I don't use that word lightly usually, but it's impossible for people in the States because of bureaucracy or because of stigma or from whatever, or just knowledge about how to actually get things like that, which is, even if they used it as an intermediary between getting their super fancy insurance approved bionic leg, they could give them something functional.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of challenges, obviously, in the American healthcare sector, starting with regulatory approval, but also just looking at the market. And with the knee specifically, there's a lot of different products out there, and it's up to the prosthetist. Usually, I mean, they're the main. It's their opinion that often carries the day in terms of what an amputee should be fit with. So it's kind of a mess of regulatory, clinicians, fragmentation, and then fundamentally the need in the U.S., despite the high number of requests, the need in the U.S. is much smaller than it is in places like South Sudan, India, Philippines, and other places.
Mark, maybe you can speak to, I know regulatory barriers are something that factor into your work. And I mean, you've been working on this for many years and had some successes, and some things move not as quickly as you'd hoped. What's good and what's bad about regulatory processes?
Well, I think for me, the biggest regulatory process is the Food and Drug Administration that's attempting to decide whether a drug is safe and whether the drug is efficacious. So is it going to help patients? And not surprisingly, the ability to make drugs that are, to make usefulness out of drugs that are in us but are nonetheless heinous toxins provides a certain challenge. And so a lot of education, but I don't mean to suggest at all that the FDA is in any way behaving in any way that they should not behave, but it is a real challenge, not just in terms of the safety and efficacy, but also the stigma in society. I mean, most people think of hydrogen sulfide as sort of, for instance, rotten eggs, and it's, a chemical warfare agent, and, or carbon monoxide, for instance, that's a cause of suicide. That's not a way you're going to help yourself.
You need some branding help from Mick.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe that's true.
Don't go with, I'm putting a chemical warfare agent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right. Don't ever say the word Frankenstein in one of your presentations. Ever.
Mick, maybe you could talk more about your process when you're identifying a problem. I mean, it's great to think, oh, I can see something and just, there's no way I can ignore this. I need to act on it. I feel like when I'm reading the news, like, I'm just overwhelmed by stuff like that. It can make me feel like there are just too many problems. So how do you pick one and decide this is going to be it?
It's a great question. It's a question that's asked a lot. We choose what we're going to do. We have a scientific method, and it's what hits you in the gut, really. So it's what speaks to you emotionally. And then if we're trying to create the most change, then we have to create a story or tell the story, not create, tell the story that can affect the most people. So we look at some things like, for example, right now we're working on a pediatric rehabilitative exoskeleton, right? And there's actually, you see exoskeletons all over the news right now, and it's the warrior of the future, or there's actually on this stage at Aspen Brain Lab, they had the EXO, which is an incredible device. But for teaching kids with cerebral palsy to walk again, you can actually teach them to walk. Because cerebral palsy, your brain is trying to fire a signal to the legs, but the legs aren't getting the signal. So this actually shoots the signal back up to the brain and says, hey, this is how you walk. And if a child uses this consecutively over a year, they can actually walk again. That's amazing. What's absurd is the gait trainers that are out there are so prohibitively expensive that kids will not walk ever in their life because this is so expensive. So that was one of those things where emotionally that hit us, but also the story for us of, hey, we have to create something that can actually show that kids, and it usually is under the age of 6, if they work on one of these things, they can walk again. That's a great story, and that's kind of an absurdity. Yeah. People are going to say, well, that's absurd. We have to have kids walk. So that's what kind of leads to the things that we choose. And we have a whole slate of different things like that.
Krista, you talk about market opportunity as something that goes into, I mean, yes, you want stuff that hits you in the gut, but also you need to think practically about market opportunity for products before, taking them to a scale. So how does that factor into your process?
So the way we think about projects is definitely like what affects you emotionally. And there, as all of you know, there are so many things that I think affect us emotionally every time we read the newspaper. And how we think about our projects is we consider the whole delivery aspect part of the design process. So in the early stages, like the R&D stage, we're looking at what technologies are out there, but we're also looking at how can we reach all the people in the world. So there's about 3 million above-knee amputees that that aren't remobilized right now. And so the available market is probably, and I say market because we take a market-driven approach even though we're a nonprofit, but probably about 1 million a year. And so how do we reach those people and how can we reach them at scale? So we spend a lot of time up front like building partnerships and making sure that not only does the product get made, does the product get to the clinics that most need it, and then how do we ensure that the amputees continue to wear the knee and are continue to be remobilized, because as you can see with our amputees like Prakash and Nesa, like they really push the limits of our knee, and we want that. And in fact, when we were doing testing with the knee that's going around, we had a contractor in Indonesia who carried a bag of cement with his knee, and we had not anticipated that additional level of weight on our knee, so we had to go back and do a little bit more engineering to address that. So, I mean, this kind of iterative process is, we expect a lot of challenges along the way, and I would say that's also something we think about from the beginning.
We only have 5 minutes left. I wanted to give an opportunity to open it up to questions, especially because you guys were so kind to come to our 8 o'clock session. Would anyone like to throw a question out to any or all of the panelists? Someone's coming around with a microphone. All right. All right. We'll go to Mick after if we have time.
How do you determine what you'll focus on next? I guess for you first.
Who's that to? You, me?
Yeah.
Kind of like what Jim said is that we look at, the stories that we tell, we make sure that we amplify them huge, right? There's a huge PR component because we're actually getting brands to tell the story because it serves them. So it's this kind of wonderful thing that we want them to tell the story as loudly as they possibly can because that's how they deem it a worthwhile investment. Well, by doing that, it actually exposes what we're doing to more people so more people have access to it. So that's kind of the wonderful little love triangle we've created there. Well, by default, for example, that exoskeleton that we're creating, that's happening because of Project Daniel, which has nothing to do with cerebral palsy or gait training or exos at all. It has to do with someone kind of seeing what we're doing and going, hey, maybe you can do something here. So that exposure to what we're doing usually sparks people to say, well, wait a second. So we get a lot of incoming calls and emails saying, hey, what about this and what about that? And then we just curate. We have a very small team, so we just look to curate it for what we think we can actually do. A lot of times we'll churn people. We actually churned a lot of people on, well, hey, you got to check out this Jaipur Knee, and you got to, we're not doing anything right now with lower limbs, so we'll try to steer people to other people that we think are doing things. But if we realize in the market there's nothing going on, we look at it and say, well, maybe we should change it. Maybe we should create something.
It's like a creative landslide. You start creating one thing, and then
Absolutely.
Opportunities present themselves, and you find other people. And collaboration, I'm sure Mark can speak to this briefly too, but you have, how much of your research has come as a result of good collaboration or of serendipity, of finding something that you weren't expecting, and because you had freedom of a creative process to ultimately end up with something useful?
Yeah, I think it's a little different for me because I guess I've spent a lot of time trying to think about the fundamental aspects of why things die and how to prevent that from happening, which is a little different than this interactive thing with society. It's more having to do with, if you will, defining what it is that sustains us and why it is that you can have asymptomatic heart attacks because you do have enough of this material that flows to the recently reperfused tissue. Sort of appreciating what life is to begin with. So it's not quite an interactive thing. It's a little more cerebral and kind of academic, actually.
One thing I think we all have in common too is a focus on the problem. Understanding the problem and digging in, and it sounds like the way you're talking about it now, it's the same thing. And I think that's different. In a lot of technology development, there's this, especially I would say in R&D around global health. A lot of times projects will start in a laboratory, and then it's a matter of scaling up. And yes, there's a problem, but not necessarily having that same interaction with a user, or having a user identify what the problem is, or understanding the bigger issues around the medical condition.
Right. So for me, a lot of the interaction is with flight surgeons in the U.S. military, and also trauma surgeons around at trauma centers around the United States, where you can see what's going on. And after temporary loss of blood flow, there's all this dying that occurs, and people have been sort of mystified by it for quite some time. So in a sense, we're related in that way. You see a problem, and then what are you going to do about it? And
Do you have any hypotheses about actually therapeutic, where you actually do something proactively to slow things down a little bit, almost as like a forced anatomical meditation?
Well, so for instance, one way that we're doing that is that if you know you're going to have cardiac bypass surgery, so it's elective, then it's reasonable to alter your metabolism before you go into it. And in a sense, I didn't have time to go into this, but the work that I do historically is actually just a more fundamental extension of what we already know as a branch of medicine called anesthesiology. So about a couple hundred years ago, we started to use, if you will, toxic agents to quiet ourselves down before people take a knife to you. Those agents are generally not ones inside of you that you have already, but rather agents that you find, like ether and things that are around that have adverse effects on people. But people had this view back in the 1820s that might be a reasonable thing to have if I'm about to, from the perspective of pain and consciousness. And so what really this is an extension of that, not so much as using agents that are outside of you, but ones you're using right now to alter your metabolism as you go about your daily life.
That's marketable, dude. People want natural products right now.
Yeah,
So.
we can definitely.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
We need to wrap it up here, but I do think tomorrow morning, instead of the morning yoga session, there should be a forced anatomical meditation session.
I agree. Totally agree.
All right, thank you so much for coming.